Welcome to T is for Trauma. I'm your host, David O'Connor. My guest today is Laura Shook Guzman, who is a trauma therapist practicing here in Austin. And this was a really special episode for me, as Laura is actually my therapist, and I've worked very closely with her for the last 3 years. In this episode, Laura talks about her own trauma at 16 that catalyzed her journey towards becoming a therapist, as well as providing introductions to somatic therapy and internal family systems, and talks about what people can expect when embarking on their own therapeutic journey and how to find the right therapist for you when starting out. This podcast was a real pleasure for me to record, and I think it is a wonderful conversation that contains a lot of valuable and actionable information. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Laura Shook Guzman. Laura, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here, David.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So this is a very special episode for me because, as I mentioned in the intro, you are actually my therapist. And I have been starting off every episode I have done with gratitude. And I have an immense amount of gratitude this episode for all of the work that we have done in the 2+ years together and all of the growth and the healing and the learning that has come from the deep work that we have done together. So I want to say that I am very thankful for that.
Beautiful. Thank you. It means a lot.
How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to being able to have this conversation in person. I was commenting on it's been a couple years since I've done in-person podcast interviews. So It's really nice.
Because you had your own podcast too, right?
Well, yes. And that was a lot of virtual. But back in the day, I even had a podcast studio at my co-working space. So I would give interviews often in that studio space. So that's kind of, what it was like when it was face-to-face. And then ever since the pandemic, I did podcasting interviews or my own online.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So if people wanted to get an introduction to you, how would you describe what you do or the work that you do with people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it's definitely evolved over the years, but I would say that right now, explaining who I am and what I do is that I am a trauma therapist. I'm trained as a somatic experiencing practitioner. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. So that means that I have a master's degree in clinical psychology with an emphasis on marriage and family. That means that we spend a lot of time, not just working with individuals during our training, but working with family systems, working with groups. And really what I loved about that focus and why I've always gone into that direction of systems work is that I really think that understanding the psychology of one human means understanding the environment that they exist inside, and that we're constantly being influenced by everything around us, and we are influencing our environment. So that's been 20+ years now. I was fortunate enough to know that I loved therapy, psychology. I was fascinated by human behavior as a young person. And so I started off with psychology straight into college and then went on to the grad school focus. So I would say, though, in the last decade, now almost 15 years, my focus has really gone into high-performing leadership, founder, entrepreneur type clients who have found so much success in so much of their lives, but are still left longing, wanting some more understanding of self. And sometimes there's a discontent or disconnection. And so my path has been doing individual therapy, family therapy, couples therapy, and also coaching. Probably that's been about 12 years. So mental health coaching, where I bring a lot of like the neuroscience, interpersonal neurobiology, somatic psychology into working with founders, entrepreneurs, and their teams, like in the startup world and business. So it's been really a beautiful journey as I look back now to think it all happened for a reason, like all the different influences that I've had over the years.
Yeah, there's a lot of different parts to that, and I hope we get a chance to dig into all that, especially the entrepreneurship stuff. But I wanted to start with what was your motivation or inspiration for getting into the world of psychology or becoming a therapist?
Yeah. Looking back, I wouldn't have known it at the time, but now I'd understand that I was an empathic child, sensitive to my environment. I was fortunate enough to grow up on a ranch where there are a lot of animals, and I found myself going towards them for comfort a lot. I would steal away to the barn and just spend time looking, connecting with the animals there. We had horses and cattle and dogs and cats. And I just felt an affinity with them that they understood me. And I later realized, like, oh, there's this sensitivity of being able to kind of pick up on animals and their energy. And then,
Horses especially,
yeah,
right?
horses especially
Yeah.
are very sensitive. Their heart energy is, their heart literally is so much bigger than ours. And so they have this beautiful energy to calm us and us to have an impact on them. So I had my own horse, and that was really,
Oh, that's
yeah, her
awesome.
name was Beauty. She was a Palomino. And so I have these memories of being on the land and being with my horses. And then in school, I was always the child that the teacher pulled aside to introduce the new kid, to give those types of, and I realized later, I was like, oh, okay, because I could tune in to my classmates, and I didn't like when I felt that people were left out. I didn't like that feeling of othering, and I wanted everyone to feel comfortable, and I could feel their discomfort. That's why I didn't understand until much later that that was my empathic nature. And so I was always bringing people into connection and bringing people into the group. And so I think that led to just this interest in people and always wanting to know what was underneath. It's like, I want to know what's underneath what you're saying. I don't know. I was always just very curious,
Yeah.
like what drives you? So I think that's really what got me started in just curiosity. And then when you go to college, you have to select that major. And I was like, psychology, that sounds really interesting. Right. So it's really started there.
I'm curious. That's fascinating that even at a young age, you had that awareness of that deeper level. Was that nurtured or kind of encouraged or observed by others?
I think back at that time, there wasn't as much understood about like HSP, like the highly sensitive person or empathic children. But luckily, my mom and dad saw it as just this. I mean, they just kind of thought of me as the emotionally sensitive kid.
Yeah.
And they did nurture that. They didn't shame or, sometimes I was a bit like teased for being so emotional, but that was more probably from my older brother than from my parents. But they kind of just knew that, okay, Laura's going to be she's going to have this emotional response, and we just need to give her a little bit of space or a little bit of comfort. But I think I had very supportive parents for that. In school, I think it was also interesting that I felt like I had a very special ability to befriend those that were not included and bring them in. And so I don't know what that was, but I was able to sort of be a bridge where sometimes when kids will go be with the unpopular or the kid that's on the outside, they will somewhat all get ostracized. But I had this kind of innate intuition of like, oh, wait, this is what we all can connect on. So I was able to bring everybody in. I think that teachers rewarded me for that. Probably later there were certain jealousies, certain discomfort that my brother had about that, because then I kind of got more attention for oh, you were so good today,
Right.
doing those different things. But I think it was mostly an attribute. I think I just felt like misunderstood though, as like a very sensitive kid.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Was there any challenges? Because, I mean, anecdotally, people that I know who were very sensitive as children, it can sometimes be kind of like a sensory overload where they experience things at such a visceral level that, even when they're still calibrating that sense as a child, even trivial things can sometimes be overwhelming. Was there anything like that?
Yeah, actually, it's funny because I thought of myself as an extrovert in a lot of ways because I could be very social. But I think that I would get overwhelmed. And that was where going to my quiet place, I would go to the tree house or go to the barn. And I think I'd get away from the overstimulation of things. But I definitely had sensitivity because I remember like finding some of my journals from my childhood and just like there was a lot of lamenting how no one understood or like, I would have these really deep responses and I just thought everyone else was so callous or cold, how can they not understand how big of a deal this is? So
Right.
I felt lonely and isolated sometimes in those ways. But then I also now look back and realize that there were some resources that were available to me at the time that I wouldn't have named them as a resource to that, but it was music and dance. So I was in a very musical family as far as singing goes. We did a lot of a cappella singing. My dad had a really great voice, so we'd sing a lot. My grandmother loved to sing, and I was a dancer from the age of 3. I started in dance classes and didn't stop until I was like 20, where I kept doing dance. So it's like I think moving my body, like being able to express through movement, through my body, what I was feeling was a way of discharging a lot of that extra sensitivity and that energy. And music, I'd just hum to myself. And so really interesting now as a therapist, knowing what I know about music and movement and the power of even like internal sound, like humming, how I was resourcing myself as a young child and person. I didn't even know it.
Yeah, it feels like more of a recent observation that those kind of forms of expression are a form of therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I date myself when I say, like 25 plus years is a long time in therapy, especially right now. We've seen such like leaps and bounds of what we understand about somatic therapy and all of the science now really the science is just confirming a lot of ancient wisdom, like things that ancient wisdom traditions have known for thousands of years. But now we have the MRIs, now we have like the data, now we have all of these brain scans. So we can actually show. So back then, even when as a child, people didn't name those things as resources. And then I think back even as a younger therapist to what I understand now as a therapist, it's a huge shift that I'm so grateful for because I feel like I've come of age as a therapist in such a wonderful time in the development of psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm hoping we can dig into that a little bit later in the episode. But you had mentioned, so you found yourself in college and on this psychology track. Was it obvious that becoming a therapist was the natural path for you?
Yeah, I was so grateful that I loved all my classes as soon as I started taking any of the psych classes. And what was interesting is you always have to pick the minor. So I had the psychology focus, and then I had to pick something else. And I was like, well, what makes sense? So I chose child development. So in my child development classes is actually when the light bulb went off, I think, that, oh, wow, there's so much potential in the human being to evolve and to have all this health and wellness, like that we're born with so much capacity and that different things happen at developmental levels, especially trauma, that can impede that development. And that's really when I started getting interested in intervention. Like, okay, now I understand human psychology, but what makes us resilient when we have to go through so much? So learning about childhood, learning about the developmental, really my best teacher at University of Texas was a developmental psychologist. And I learned so much from her. Later, I was like to get her recommendation to go to grad school because I learned from her what it meant to have developmental trauma and how we could intervene at earlier stages and the importance of family intervention or systems intervention, reforming, schools and being able to make sure that we were intervening really early on so that children would have a better chance and that children have so much growth potential. But as we experience challenges in life, which we all will, there's different ways in which each individual psyche and body will respond to that trauma. And so that just fascinated me. Like, okay, we could focus on all the things that happen, or we could also focus on all the ways in which we are somehow resilient in that. That was my big, I remember in college actually driving down I-35 in Austin, there was a moment where I was like, oh, I just want to study resilience. I thought it was like such a big, like that term wasn't really big at the time. Thought I was really onto something. And now we have a wealth of data and research about what it is to be resilient in the human psyche.
Yeah. I mean, what does that word mean for you now?
Yeah. I mean, I think that for me, what it means is the ability to return to self, even after multiple layers of trauma or disconnection. So the resilience is the ability to return to self and to be able to return to integration and cohesion, alignment in ourselves. And that's really, I mean, we can talk more in probably detail about, what does health and well-being mean to me, or what am I helping, clients move towards? And so for me, that we're tracking resilience tracking resilience is seeing, okay, how do these interventions help this person integrate, heal, return to this coherence, this harmony inside of themselves? And then how does that create resilience moving through their life so that they can continue to remember that, like have a felt sense of that wellness and that harmony in their body, and then they return to that. So resilience is the return constantly back, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people that I've worked with haven't had a felt embodied sense of that self energy, of that core part of them to return to. And so a lot of the work for me as a trauma therapist is like, let's get back to what that essential core self felt like in your body before the different trauma experiences occurred, because I believe it's still there in everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say personally, I've had a very love-hate relationship with the word resilience because, for me, resilience was how much damage can you take and still keep going. So like, especially in this deep work with regards to the sexual abuse in the last 2 years, like my natural inclination based off decades of doing it was to just put myself in the grinder and like keep pushing and, running myself really thin. And, realizing that resilience is not like putting yourself in the meat grinder. It's being kinder to yourself and like slowing down and just being gentle and being compassionate and practicing or exercising self-care was a real like aha moment, but also a real struggle because, you have this lifetime system of doing it one way. And it's like, oh, there's actually an easier way. That's also an easier way. And it's definitely been a learning experience.
I'm glad that you named that actually, because I think that's going to resonate with a lot of listeners, because I've heard that from other clients as well, that, oh, I thought that resilience is like something I'm supposed to achieve and then, means I'm resilient to just keep going and going and going. And I think we live in this culture that sort of worships productivity and a linear ascent, to our goals. And so I think it's really good that we're talking about that. Resiliency is something that takes a lot of self-love and self-care, and it's just a return to something that you've already always possessed. But our trauma, what one of my teachers, Peter Levine, says about trauma, it's one of my favorite definitions, very super simple. And he says, simply put, trauma is a disorder of presence. And our ability to return to the present moment, despite the traumatic experiences, being able to return to, oh, this is the here and the now, and this is me, that increases our resiliency, because there's going to be constant things in our life that is going to challenge us, that's going to take us out of our center. And so it's a matter of how we return. It's not a matter of getting beyond it to somewhere where we're untouched, where we can't feel any more of that. Oh, I'm so beyond that
Right.
I'm not affected. It's like, unfortunately, we never get to that part of life where it's just smooth sailing. But it's like, how do we keep coming back to ourselves despite the tension, the conflict, the difficult pressures around us?
Yeah, it's also something I've been going back recently and listening to both of Terrence Real's books, and he talks a lot about that of there are going to be traumatic things in life. It's unavoidable, but it's that ability to downregulate and bring yourself back to your baseline state. But also to speak to something that you mentioned that I think, and I'm definitely guilty of this too, that I think a lot of people have this idea of therapy is going to bulletproof, where it's like, I'm not going to be hurt by these things anymore. And that's what I'm getting from therapy is this invulnerability to harm, when really it's a framework for downregulating back to your baseline state, because these things are still going to hurt you.
Exactly. Yes. It's not like a linear path with a start and a finish. It's much more of a spiral. It's circular. If anyone's walked a labyrinth, that's a very good metaphor for what it is like to do therapy. You traverse all of these pathways, which sometimes you're like, am I going? Did I pass that already? I feel like I'm in a circle. I'm not really sure where I'm going, but I'm going deeper. I'm deeper into center. And then once you're in the center, it's like you're connecting. Like in a labyrinth, it's the connection to spirit, divine, or earth elements. Like there, you nourish self. And then it's the journey back out into the world to be more connected to the world now that you've connected to self. And it will happen over and over again. You'll come back out and you'll come back in, and then you walk out. And I see a therapist as being someone who helps you walk that spiral without feeling so alone. Right? That can validate this is a normal response to abnormal stress, that the human body is very capable of handling a lot and our bodies will adapt. That doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it something we want to do. And definitely as human beings, being mammals, we're wired to be able to do these things together. Yeah. We can withstand much more when we are in connection with one another. And so I really see my job as a guide, as a facilitator that's like helping mirror back or be that nervous system. For some of my clients, it's like, what's it like to be able to have someone sit and hold this with you, right? Because people are on their own, they're thinking, I don't want to go back into that memory. I don't want to go into that time. It's too overwhelming because they're used to only going there alone. But if you have someone that's going with you, especially a trained person who's done a lot of work on their own nervous system regulation, like so much of my training is experiential and my own ability to go inward. And so I track with my clients, lending them the support and the container of my own nervous system during the work.
Right.
Yeah.
It acts as a mirror.
Yeah.
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 In terms of the path for that skill development, did your work start in the child development space, or did it start somewhere else?
So it definitely started my interest. I thought I would be a play therapist. I really focused with children and families. And then over time, so that was definitely probably very much of my beginning years. But then over time, I realized that I enjoyed working with adults that were further along in their life and that needed the healing. So I guess I worked with children because I wanted to intervene early. And yet with the adults that I started to work with, I realized there was this beauty of being able to go back and do the reparative work with them. So I've been on all ends of the spectrum, I guess. But I think this is probably a good time to name a little bit of the personal influence. So there's being the empathic child, being really tuned into people. But really what probably I said to my mother later, maybe in grad school, I was like, this is why I think I went through the trauma in our family the way that I did so that I could help others.
Yeah.
And I was a child. I was 16 when I lost my oldest and only brother.
Oh.
And so it was a sudden loss. It was a car accident. And so from one moment to the next, it went from a family of 4 that, I at 16 counted on being there for a long, long time, to a sudden change where all of a sudden he was gone and my mom and dad were shattered.
Yeah.
And I was there 16 trying to be there for them. So that was a really significant moment that at the time I didn't even have the time to process, because I was like going to take care of my mom and dad.
Right.
And so I think that caretaking, being empathic, being a caretaker, could feel the pain in the household. I wanted to learn more about how I could think of that professionally. I was like, okay, I'm fascinated by this, but at the time I wasn't even connecting it to my grief experience. It was more of an unconscious desire to go out and help others, having that role be very familiar to me at home.
Yeah.
And then when I ended up in grad school, and then I started working through a lot of children that were unfortunately had lost their parents, I was working face to face with a lot of grief and loss, and thought that I was going to be a bereavement specialist. And that was the time I told my mom, I was like, there's a reason that I lost Steve, my brother. It's given me a whole new level of compassion to work with these kids. And so it felt very important that I did the work, at that point. But it was interesting, even then it was limited to, well, this is a big grief and I understand what it's like to be in grief. I honestly didn't even call it a trauma. I just called it grief. But as I matured in my life, and then I had another grief trauma, sudden loss, not through death, but through a separation from my daughter's father, all of a sudden a family unit that had to change again. I had a family of 3, and then it was just my daughter and I suddenly. And so in that time is when I had already been working as a trauma therapist for, I don't know, like 6-7 years. And then I began to understand that, oh, this is related. I have all this unresolved trauma, unresolved grief. Like I've just been going and being the golden child and taking care of everybody, even making it my profession.
Yeah.
And it wasn't till like on the cusp of turning 30 that I began to really get curious about what I wasn't allowing myself to feel. And here I was, like, guiding my clients.
That was definitely going to be my question was, and I think this is a story that a lot of people listening will be familiar with at a personal level, of like this traumatic event happening and either an internalized or externalized expected role of caretaker, and then springing into action and then not creating space for your own processing. I mean, I'm not sure what the question I want to ask here is, but, if you could talk to like the challenges of kind of plowing through that and just kind of going and then, the rubber has to meet the road at some point.
Very well put. And that was exactly it. Yes, that makes me actually feel more connected to all the listeners, thinking, yes, most of us they're going to resonate with that experience. I think for me, it was definitely becoming the golden child. There was no room to grieve because I needed to perform. My parents weren't really expecting me to perform, but I needed control in my environment. So I put all of that energy into achievement, into striving, into getting the best grades that I could, and putting the goals to go to the college that I wanted. And so putting aside, the challenges are that you put aside all these things, all the feelings, for all of the things that everyone rewards you to do.
Yeah.
That's the trick. That's the trap. Because no one stopped me and said, "Are you sure you're okay?" Instead, they saw me excelling and they assumed, well, she's okay.
Yeah.
Look, she's handling this well. She's moving through the grief. It's not going to tear her apart. And so you get rewarded for being so resilient. I'm using quotes here, like resilient, like your definition is like everyone wants you to keep going. And as an empath, I felt them let out a sigh of relief. Like my teachers, my parents are like, okay, she's good.
Yeah.
So that felt good to me. They all are not going to worry about me. And so you get into that trap of going and going and going and striving and setting bigger goals. And it feels great because everyone tells you that, just pats you on your back and rewards that. And on the inside, I was not at that time in my 20s for sure. I wasn't conscious of it. On the inside, I just basically had frozen. That 16-year-old, she was exiled, to use internal family systems language, which we can define for the listeners in a moment. It's like I just exiled that 16-year-old, and she held the grief story, and everything else just went ahead and strove to impress and to achieve.
So did you have maybe like a oh shit moment is maybe too extreme, but was there a point where you had this realization like, oh, I have structured my entire life path around it on maybe like a parallel course to my own personal trauma? Is this the right direction for me? Like, do I need to recalibrate here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Let me think. With therapy, I've never questioned that therapy was the right path for me to continue to help others. But I think there was a moment there where in my late 20s, when the separation between myself and my partner at the time, and that was my life partner whom I was planning my entire future and had a daughter with. So when that ground broke away and I went into depression and overwhelm, that was when I questioned what's going on here.
Yeah.
I'm upset, but I'm really upset. Like, I told my clients that if you're ever having a strong reaction that seems bigger than the current, like it's bad what you're going through, but if it's really, really feels overwhelming, there might be something also that you're grieving.
Yeah.
And that was the aha moment of, there's something bigger. What have I not dealt with? And through my own journaling and reflecting and my own therapy, and honestly working with the most amazing acupuncturist at the time, was when I started to feel the grief in my body and started to have memories of my 16-year-old exile emerged.
Yeah.
And I was ready for her then. I was ready to listen and hear her story in a way that I just hadn't been ready before. And it was like I was too broken open by the current grief to ignore the past.
Yeah. Right, because you hadn't made space for it before that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like one of those moments where it stopped me, but in a good way.
Yeah, it was
It's
very
like,
necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I felt that. I felt like I couldn't function at that time. Like, I didn't know what to do, and I had to strive to be there for my daughter. She needed me she was only 3. So I was like, I have to show up, but I can't. I'm like depressed. I just want to sleep. I don't want to do anything. All my motivation, all my future dreams are just shattered. And so I knew that there was a need to do that work. And honestly, that is when I deepened my work in somatic psychology. I'd already been tracking that, but there was a lot of cognitive behavioral training at that time when I graduated. It was 2000. So this was just at the early stages of somatic work. And when this happened in 2004, I think maybe it was something like that, that's when I dug deeper into somatic therapy because I needed it.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent point to segue. So even in my own case, I only really became familiar with somatic work in probably the last 3 years. So can you explain to people what is somatic therapy and kind of how does it show up for people?
Yeah, absolutely. So somatic psychology can have many different modalities. Like psychologists have developed different frameworks, but they're all under the umbrella of a body-based psychotherapy. in which we understand not just the cognitive thoughts and the emotions that we have, but the felt sense in the body of our experiences. It's interesting because the realm of psychology has relied on the mind for a very, very long time. And it was still in that realm when I was early on in my studies, where it was about cognitive behavioral. If you change your thoughts, you can change your behavior. Now, this is true to a certain extent, and it's a great intervention for a lot of symptoms. But you'll remember that I was going into trauma work. So I was learning cognitive behavioral therapies, family systems, internal family systems. At the time was not very somatically based. It was all like understanding the theory of like how individuals exist and how they exist within the family and how they can be scapegoated or they can have certain roles. And that can perpetuate certain like dysfunctional patterns. So we were all about like analyzing, assessing, and then the interventions were like to bring insight into the client's mind, and then they would know and understand and they would change their behavior. Well, I tried that, and over again, I had clients that at this moment I was working with women who were survivors of domestic violence, so both familial and societal violence, and their children. And these women would come to me and they would say, I really appreciate last session. It made a lot of sense. But then I went home and my mind said what you told me, but my body refused.
Mm-hmm.
I could not get my body on board. And I kept hearing that over and over again. My body doesn't agree. My body's not listening. My body keeps hijacking. So I was like, okay, the body keeps saying no to all the therapy interventions. What's going on? And that's when I really began to understand that there was an emerging field of study that was looking at how trauma is stored in the body, what it has to do with the nervous system, and how there are these automatic responses that the human body and brain will do to keep itself safe. And that all those cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that I was teaching, they were going offline. Yeah. So I know I'm going into more detail than just defining
this is
somatics,
perfect.
but I hope, yeah.
And
like
this actually tracks perfectly with my own experience because we somewhat started to work together by accident. And I was not familiar at all with somatic therapy when I started. I was coming in from an analytical background. And I was like, all of my problems are just in my mind. Like I can just talk them out. And I was like, I'm working with this woman. She's talking about energy. Like we're feeling into like the feelings. I was like, what are we doing? Like this, I need to talk it out. Talk. And it's like, as I started to kind of, I'm not even going to say connect. I'll say reconnect the physical felt experience with the mental. That I think is when the progress started to happen because, just for years I was like, oh, I'm smart. I'll just think my way out of my emotional problems. And, that was incredibly, there was a lot of hubris in that approach, but also it's very short-sighted because, like you said, the body keeps the score and you have to either acknowledge that or it's just not going to, you're not going to move the needle without integrating the entire system.
Exactly. And I'm so glad that you named, your confusion and resistance around it, because a lot of my initial work with clients is helping them like baby step into what does that mean to know energy and what is that? It's like a new language. Actually, one of my clients says, this is like learning a new language. It's like, yeah, except it's a language you've always known and you were born knowing this. But we as human beings have evolved to be overly dependent on the prefrontal cortex, the thinking mind, because we think it's the best solution. We can just analyze our way out. There's like, even in our understanding as we grow up and we go to school, like no one teaches us about the autonomic nervous system except in health class. And you're just learning about it as how it makes your body work. What you don't learn is how it does impact your choices and your body's response, your emotional response. And as I teach clients, oh, that's just your body saying no. Let's listen and understand what are the cues of danger that it's perceiving. And with what we understand about trauma being a disorder of presence, it means that your nervous system is often in the past and it's perceiving its current environment as if the trauma is still occurring. So something like someone, for example, someone who's had a car accident on a bridge, they have a fear of crossing the bridge and they know that. And they're like, yeah, it's irrational. Like, I know I'm going to be fine. It's not going to happen. I'm in a safe car. But every time I go over the bridge, I have a panic attack. And I've told myself over and over to just drive across the bridge, but I cannot. I get immobilized.
Yeah.
Right? This is a great example of where you can't just keep using cognitive behavioral tools to talk that person into it. You have to help them understand, how do we get the nervous system back into the present? So in therapy, that might look like visioning that bridge, and doing some work around. So where is that moment where you knew you were safe in your body after the accident occurred? We really focus on, when did you know you were safe? Because your body still remembers that you're in the accident. But when we ask, where do you feel that knowing? And people will often go, well, it's that moment where the firefighter put his blanket around my shoulders. I remember that. I remember feeling that I was alive. Okay, let's go there. And then we spend time getting that story caught up into the present, and the body remembers. The nervous system is slow and it needs to discharge energy. So that client during a session like that might start to feel a little buzzy or might feel some energy leaving their hands or their feet. And that can overwhelm people. People get nervous about sensation. So then I say, it's okay. We just let that energy move through and release and let the nervous system know that you made it out of that accident. Right?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And, having done this work, it's still so, and I don't know if this is everybody's experience, but it feels so unfamiliar sometimes. And, also so foreign to have these reactions or sensations, knowing that you are in a safe place, in a non-hostile environment, to still have these internal triggering states of danger or high anxiety or nervousness, to step back into those moments.
Yeah, and people are so critical of themselves, like, what's wrong with me? If they know that they're not in danger, but they keep having these symptoms of anxiety or immobilization. And so I find that so much of the work, like you said, it feels very unfamiliar. But as people do it, it becomes more and more of like, oh, this is what that means. And I can trust now my body, or I can trust those sensations. What Peter Levine actually explains to us through his somatic experiencing, which is one of my foundational trainings, is that, as human beings, because we think about things so much, we understand to a certain extent what's happening, and we have all this need to resist it, or we want to do something about it. So if we're in a situation that's life-threatening, we're trying to analyze our way out of it. And we don't like feeling the overwhelm that comes, or the sudden intensity of mobilization energy. So if our system is flooded by an intense emotion or energy, we will often have this instinct to stop it. Yeah. So I'm going to stop myself from trembling. I'm going to stop myself from feeling this way. And so we shut down what is really a protective response in the body. Now, animals don't have the pre-developed, the frontal cortex that's so developed as ours. They do have a lot of really smart brains, but they're wired to just follow their biology. So if a small animal is being pursued by a larger predator, then it doesn't think about, should I be here or not? Or, gosh, I shouldn't have taken that right turn or whatever. It's just like, it's just going to go into its most, the protective response that makes the most sense. It will flee, it will shut down and freeze, or it'll fight.
Yeah.
And it will do that and it'll let the whole completion process happen. And that's why when you see animals come out of immobilization, especially, you'll see them shaking. Animals will shake their body. And yet human beings, we don't like feeling out of control. So we will, start to like shut down that shaking. Oh, I'm shaking. This is weird. And so we just try to talk ourselves out of like, I don't know why I'm so freaked out right now. I'm totally fine. I just need to keep walking. And so we just don't let our biology complete.
Right. Just flush it out.
We really kind of stop it.
Yeah.
We're powerful. The brain is a powerful brake, but the body is more powerful than the brain. So even though the brain's like, I totally took care of this, we're fine. The body's like, no, you didn't. I'm still holding that story. And anytime I sense something in my environment that reminds me of that story, I'm going to try again to protect you.
Right. So you just keep paying that debt and paying that debt.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Until that you learn that you can open yourself and widen the container is what I call it. Like we have this, and Buddhists call it the subtle body, which I think is a great term because we have a physical body that ends where our skin and bones are. And then the Buddhists call it this energetic is the subtle body. And we have this ability to trust, to widen this energetic body and let energy move through. And people just get scared by it. And so they don't know how to open, and they will go right back up into their head and they'll try to analyze it from there. And back to my own story, I mean, that's what I found is that I was so analytical and I thought I understood all about my grief because I learned about it.
Yeah.
But I hadn't processed the grief that was still in my body. And that really started showing up at the second round of like another big significant loss. I had that debt. And so it just like kept perpetuating. So it was my own journey into my body. So I don't ask my clients to do any of the work that I haven't already done within my own system.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that phrase. I believe it's also a Buddhist phrase as you talk about that stuff. That which you resist persists.
Yes, yes, yes. And we resist feeling intense energy. As human beings, it's interesting because I can ask someone, what are you feeling? And most people will be able to identify that pretty easily. Like, well, I'm just feeling sad. But when I ask, well, how's your body telling you that you feel sad? That's a hard one for most people.
Right.
Right? But it's that deeper intelligence of the body that somatic psychotherapy is really interested in. It's a bottom-up process. It's like, let's go into the body, understand the language of sensation, and then how is the body interpreting that sensation? Then it's going into the brain, and then you're creating meaning based on your experiences. But all the initial information is being felt through the nervous system.
This feels like a good point to segue. You've mentioned family systems and internal family systems several times. What is IFS?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you asked. I feel like a lot of people now that come through my office have heard of it to some extent. It's about 40 years old now. It's a modality that was created by Dr. Richard Schwartz in the 80s. So that means that when I started learning about it, it was only like 20 years in the making. And so at that point, it wasn't very somatic based. But it is the understanding that there is a multiplicity of the human psyche. And he said that his patients taught him this. He says, they taught me that there were parts in them, and that he noticed over and over people would use this language, this parts language, and they would say, well, yeah, that's true, but there's also this part of me that wants the opposite. And so this understanding has led all this 40 years now of using this parts framework has led us to realize that it's true that not just in IFS, but other traditions, that there's usually a core self. So internal family systems applies the systemic type of theory. So there's family systems in which everything that's happening inside the family influences the individual. And so he was like, so why would we not understand that inside of us, as we have these different parts, they have different roles, they have different dynamics, relationships. So there's this inner world, this inner relational world that if we could understand, we might be able to create more long-lasting psychological change. And so when we do internal family systems, we are really helping to identify what are the different, we're mapping the parts of someone. And there's three main categories. We have the exiles, which are our wounded parts. We have our managers, which are very proactive protectors. And we have firefighters, which are the reactive protectors. And when trauma occurs, or long developmental lines, whenever something significant happens that's threatening to the body or to the psyche, often certain parts of the self will emerge to protect your most vulnerable parts. So if you have something you can't endure, it's too intense, then you have this protector part. So in my case, I had this golden child, this part of me that was very proactive, and she was really good at school and in negotiating social relationships and advancing in a society where as long as you just keep going to school and having accolades and you're good. And then my exile was the 16-year-old that was holding the grief of losing her brother. So, just using myself as an example, the healing occurs when the therapist can help me be able to come into contact with my essential self. This is the self that we're all born with. And Dr. Schwartz has like the all the different C's. I think it's 8 C's that define the self, you know? And so maybe between the two of us, we can name them all. But it's like sometimes I forget. But it's like calm, curious, connected, compassionate, centered, right? Those words, when those are present with you, you know that you're in your self energy. And he uses the capital S. This is the self with a capital S. And this is our self that we're born into the world with. And then as things happen, these different parts will sort of split off, these multiplicity of our persona, of our subpersonality. And so a therapist will help you identify your self energy and be able to start noticing and mapping these different parts. Unfortunately, we often become blended. So I became very blended with my manager parts. And so I didn't understand that that wasn't just me. I am the achiever. What are you talking about? That's who I am. That's my identity. And so through my work with IFS, I was able to separate, unblend from that part, and then access more self-energy that was able to then relate to the 16-year-old exile. And the exiled parts often think of us at the age in which the trauma occurred. So the exile thought she was still talking to a 16-year-old who didn't know what to do with all these emotions. When she was able to encounter my self-energy, then she was relieved to rest into a space where she was heard, comforted, given space to feel, and because she had been told and made to feel that she couldn't have that grief. It was too inconvenient.
Yeah.
Right?
And there was other work to be done.
And there was other work to be done to keep achieving, right? So that's what's really beautiful. I'm sure there's really some other succinct ways of describing IFS, but I think it's helpful because anybody can go and Google internal family systems. You can learn more about it, but really understanding how it would look by giving my system as an example. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, I think that was also a revelation for me of, and I know Richard Schwartz talks about this in No Bad Parts, of asking these parts that show up what age they are, or if they feel like they're a certain age, and using this as a way of informing what time period in your life that this pain or trauma might have originated from.
Yes. Yeah. And people can feel really self-conscious and a little silly at first when they're doing the work. I don't know if you had that experience or not, but you know what?
Absolutely.
I'm like, notice that. And they're like, okay, that's weird. Like, what? I'm supposed to be asking this part in me, So I'm always like reminding people that imagination is also one of our healing tools, and our ability to imagine that we can connect into these parts like brings forth the space inside of ourselves. And as you practice, you start realizing, well, some parts do show up and they're like, finally, you're paying attention and they're really clear and you don't doubt them. You're like, oh my gosh, that's so. And I have people all the time say, this is going to sound really strange, XYZ, right? And then I'm like, it's not going to sound strange to me.
It's not my first rodeo.
Don't worry. But they're always like, this is weird. And they go on to explain it. And then I'm like, that makes so much sense, because of what you were just saying. Like, this sounds like this, let's get curious about this part and let it start emerging. And then things start to make sense. So I think it's really being open for some people that are just like, gosh, what would this be like? Knowing that when you first start off with somatic work and when you first start off with IFS, it might feel like you're learning to ride a bicycle for the first time, but just keep practicing it. And you'll start to realize that there is a whole nother level of information and a new language, as my other client calls it, this new language that you can remember, really. It's this language that's been there all along.
Yeah. I did want to ask, just before we move on, about you had mentioned Peter Levine being one of your mentors, and I'm not sure how we would characterize Peter Levine. Maybe is it fair to say he's one of the godfathers of modern trauma therapy or somatic work?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Peter Levine was really one of the first to bring a therapeutic intervention because he came from the sciences. And, and this is true for several of them. There's also Stephen Porges, who developed the polyvagal theory, which I don't know if we have time to get into that one today, but it's a really fascinating one. But he needed, when he brought it, it was very hard to understand. And then Deb Dana translated that into therapy language. And Peter Levine was able to take what we understand about the autonomic nervous system and trauma and create a training program for therapists to learn and apply. So he's very much, and he's right there with Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor Mate. I mean, there's just so many. Dan Siegel. I mean, these are people that I've been learning from, and I'm so grateful because they all started this back in the 70s, 80s, and they've just been persistent to bring it to the mainstream and to train therapists like myself that are front line to be able to bring this latest science and magic into the work.
Yeah, and it's so funny because when I had first started my psychedelics journey and realized I had this intense childhood trauma, people kept recommending books by Peter Levine to me. And, I went through several in a very short space of time. And then we were working together. And I think it was a couple of months in that you mentioned working under Peter Levine. And I was like, wait, hold on a minute. This feels very important to mention.
Right. And you're like, oh, wait. And then the serendipity of you're hearing it too, thinking, wait, this is something I need to hear.
Right.
Right. But yes, I mean, I'm so grateful for Peter's work. And honestly, I dove into his work as an intervention support to myself personally, doing the grief trauma work that I was doing for myself. And I was really hopeful I was going to learn a whole new way to work with my clients. And it changed everything. I mean, Peter's ability, and anybody that's interested, I think his first book is Waking the Tiger.
Right.
And it's a great read because it just really lays out this whole understanding of the basic model of the autonerve, how we have these defense responses and that trauma happens because we don't complete. We have a lack of completion in our trauma, in our protective responses that get stored in the body. And then these symptoms that are showing up for us are not just a personal flaw or an unsolvable issue. It's oh, this anxiety derives from a specific event in which a trauma resolution did not complete, and the body nervous system is going to continue to be hypervigilant or hypovigilant until there is a ability to release that energy and return to homeostasis.
Yeah. This actually is a good segue to maybe a more everyday conversation, which is what are some of the ways that trauma manifests itself in people's everyday lives?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question because we hear the word trauma thrown a lot around, and people are like, "What exactly?"
Podcasts.
What is it? I have trauma. Well, and I think, they say that, I don't know, recent data before the pandemic, it was like 70% of the population experienced trauma, and I'm thinking now it's more, but I would even say 99% of us, because you can have life-threatening. Trauma is seen as anything that's an experience that is life-threatening. That can be either like one-off, or it can be developmental or over time, so complex trauma. But what trauma looks like, so you can have a traumatic incident in which your life feels threatened, and then you can process that, immobilize, have all your mobilizing energy, and complete that process and not have trauma in your system. So I think that's important for people to understand. Just because you go through something doesn't mean you actually will have debilitating symptoms after.
Yeah, that was a real aha moment in Waking the Tiger, was that there's not a linear relationship between trauma in and trauma out. And then also that he makes the differentiation between big T trauma and little t trauma. And a big T trauma can obviously be very impactful, but also a series of little t traumas can also add up to a cumulative effect of somebody being very traumatized.
Exactly. So I think I like to describe it, for people, the easiest way to understand is dysregulation in the system shows different symptoms. So if we're dysregulated to a state of being, often there's the analogy of there's the autonomic nervous system, and your sympathetic is like your gas pedal. And we all need the sympathetic nervous system. It's what gets us up going in the day, but it also becomes very active when we're fleeing or trying to protect ourselves. And so if you have a trauma in which your nervous system went into its hypervigilance, into sympathetic arousal to mobilize, to protect, but that was not completed, then you'll stay in a hypervigilant state, which looks like insomnia, anxiety, panic attacks, irritability, and that kind of constantly feeling like you're always on edge, and difficulty focusing, difficulty concentrating. So that means your brake is, your gas pedal is on too often. And then if you're in maybe an immobilized, so hypoarousal is your parasympathetic that's gone offline. In people who shut down, avoid, numb, disassociate to protect themselves, that's usually the threat is so overwhelming that you can't try to flee or fight it. So you retreat from it. And those symptoms will look like sleeping too much. So instead of not being able to sleep, it's sleeping too much. Dysregulation in appetite, where the brake, the gas pedal is like eating not enough. This one would be the brake. And so you'd be overeating, oversleeping, exhausted, irritable, and also, difficulty focusing. But it's this kind of hypo, it's a collapse response versus so that person is someone that you just think, are they not gonna get up? Are they not motivated? They just seem like really lethargic.
Yeah.
So those are those extremes, right? So thinking of, is your gas pedal always on, or is your brake pedal always depressed, right?
Yeah.
Always on. And so if you're experiencing those symptoms as you're on those different ends of the nervous system, because if we're in the middle, then the nervous system might get hyperactive, or it might, it needs to go into sympathetic to be able to move around and do all the things in the world. But it also needs to be able to move into parasympathetic to sleep. So that's the rest and digest.
Yeah.
So I kind of like to think of it as, when you start having those extremes, then that's a sign that your body is possibly in one of those branches of the autonomic nervous system in a way that it's not able to get itself to rebound.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that they're two sides of the same coin?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just this is my own theory. I don't, through the years, what I've seen is that I'm sure there's maybe somebody out there that has been trying to study, but what I've noticed as a therapist is that people kind of have a default survival pattern. So that's got started with some of their early experiences to trauma. So if you were a very young child and you experienced trauma when you were very vulnerable and you couldn't mobilize, then often you tend to have more of a hypo, a collapse, like because you had to get small to try to be safe.
Yeah.
And so later on in life, if you have something that is threatening, then your body will try that response first. It will go more into collapse. Versus if you had a response in which you were able to flee and you were able to fight and protect yourself, then that default survival pattern will often be, that'll be the first one that shows up on the scene as kind of this angry, like protective, get bigger. So kind of a leaving pattern and getting small pattern, or getting bigger and fighting. And it's just, I don't know, my own experience that often whatever somebody's really early experience, that becomes kind of the default, later on in life.
Yeah. Are there any, I don't know if we would call them symptoms or ways of acting in or acting out that maybe people are less familiar with?
That's a good question. Because I think that let's see, acting in, well, I mean, this is something you and I've kind of talked about, that I would say that one of the things is in our society that one of the trauma responses, that's my story, that is rewarded and is often not seen is the overachievement as a trauma response.
Yeah.
So that one's not often identified as having anything problematic about it because it's so adaptive. So you have some symptoms that are very maladaptive, right? They interfere with your ability to go to work. And of course, we know that not everybody who experiences, just to back up a little bit, not everybody who experiences trauma develops post-traumatic stress disorder. You have to have pervasive experiences of those symptoms over time, and then that qualifies under the DSM-4. But, people can be living with trauma, never have received a diagnosis of PTSD, especially if they never saw it as impairing their function. They would never have really sought help for it either. So one of those is people that are, that I see a lot in my practice, that are very high performers, high achieving. They are often CEOs on leadership teams and startups, entrepreneurs, founders, and their trauma response of being able to just keep striving, keep going, moving away from the trauma or the stress by becoming more and more successful is very much rewarded. So people would not think of themselves as like having a trauma response because I'm super successful. But those are the clients that usually come to me and say, I have all this success, or I have all this that I'm really proud of and accomplishments, but I still feel very disconnected. I still feel very empty, or feel like I'm not content, and I don't know what's going on here.
Yeah, it's something that I think about a lot. And I know I had talked in the last episode with my guest about this, especially when it comes to the process addictions. Like a number of them are very socially acceptable, like workaholism, like, the hardest working man in Hollywood, or like an Elon Musk who's, his pee breaks are timed because he's so busy. And then like something like working out, like these world-class athletes, and they're working out 10 or 12 hours a day, or especially with men, like extreme promiscuity being very rewarded and things like that. And I think definitely it's very tricky for people, especially like if this is the thing that you have derived your success from or your identity from, to kind of divorce that and say like, oh wait, this isn't coming from a healthy place. Like, even though society is not telling me this is wrong, internally it feels, you have this felt sense of like, hey, this is maybe not the healthiest direction for me, or this is not making me happy.
Yes. I'm really grateful that you named process addictions, because we actually used to think of addictions as like a mental health disorder itself, or like this thing that was this personal flaw in this person is, choosing this addiction. And then we understood, oh, this is actually a disease or an illness. But then we still saw it as like separate as itself, as it exists. Oh, this is this kind of addiction. Thankfully, tracking with the trauma research and trauma therapy's evolution over the last 40 years, really understand that most addictions are a coping response to discomfort in the nervous system, and which is response to trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to reference somebody that you had mentioned earlier, I know Gabor Mate is doing like a podcast tour right now because of his new book coming out. And I've learned so much from him about addiction as not an addiction to a thing or a substance, more as a coping mechanism and an escape from an underlying problem.
Exactly. And this is what I love about Gabor Mate is his compassionate approach. It's so much more compassionate, and that is in alignment with everything that I not only know but feel intuitively when I work with my clients. Like, we are not talking about something that needs to be fixed. We're talking about something that needs to be seen and heard and understood. And that I love that about Dr. Schwartz too. No bad parts. We're going to befriend the parts. We're going to understand that, and there's a beautiful interview between Alanis Morissette and Dr. Schwartz on her openly talking about her work addiction and her different process addictions, and how IFS was so game-changing for her because she was able to understand that these parts of her had developed to keep her safe, and that the work addiction was not something to berate and criticize, but it was something, a part of her to get curious about and to understand what it is protecting her from feeling. And that's what I've noticed with a lot of my high performers, is that there is these levels of work addiction and other types of addictions. Usually there's not just one. And it's these, and Dr. Schwartz calls them, most of the addictive parts, he'll call firefighters.
Yeah. And
their job is to exterminate the feelings. They're actually not the heroic firefighters. They're really like, they're called to the scene because there is emotion that's coming up. And when those addictions come, they are behavior that can distract, that can numb, that can give temporary relief. And so you can spend your whole life, being pulled by these addictive behaviors that are all about coping, and not being able to relieve yourself of those means that you don't have the experience of being free to return to the self energy that is the integrated parts. Like, once this healing occurs, then those parts start to realize they can have a different job, or maybe they don't need to be around anymore, and they're relieved that they don't have to work so hard. They're tired of being the work addiction.
Yeah. And, this is also something that I am incredibly grateful to be alive right now. And kind of in the same way as you talk about the leaps that the field of therapy has made, I think also in popular culture, more and more, I'm going to say influencers, but I don't mean in the pop culture sense. I mean, people of influence are coming forward and talking about where this drive comes from, and like their own personal traumas and like the things that are maybe getting rewarded that are not as healthy. And I think this has been very helpful because, even though most people will never achieve that level of success or global influence that they do, it still resonates with people at a lower level, because I think, like you were saying, I think this is an experience that a lot of people have and connect with, and it is helpful to be informed about what the origin of a lot of these things is.
Yeah, I do feel like there's just so much more understanding, and now just the science to back up certain things that a lot of therapists felt, and psychologists and scientists felt intuitively, but we didn't have the evidence. And we used to laugh and call that kind of like, woo, how much of that is just but now we have I've always known it, but now I can actually present the science and the understanding of the nervous system. I have a lot of startup teams starting to come into my practice that are looking for, how are we going to be a better team? And they want to take personality assessments and try to just understand one another better, which I'm all for. But what I'm trying to help them understand is that this is a new paradigm of not just understanding the main personality, but really understanding that there are things affecting, there's stories affecting all of you, and there's trauma that might be affecting the founders that created this company. And we really need to bring more awareness, more consciousness to these sort of the underbelly of these organizations, the parts that, it's not just a team offsite where we're going to do a little trust building. It's like we really need to look at what are the zones of safety inside each of you and inside your company.
Yeah.
And whatever we're feeling, because all of our organizations and systems are made of individuals. So whatever's happening in the individual is happening within the larger organizations and in our teams, in our communities, in our greater social world. So I'm constantly working both ends of it. I'm working with the individual, and then I'm loving Gabor Mate's most recent work around understanding the toxic culture and like how if we don't learn to understand this, we're normalizing things that are toxic. And if we don't understand that, we're going to just keep doing it.
Yeah.
And healing is much harder in a system that perpetuates the trauma, in a culture that perpetuates the trauma.
So I know a lot of people who listen to this podcast have made comment to me about wanting to do the work, but not being sure where to start. So if you are someone who maybe has an intuition of wanting to do this work, how would somebody know whether they have trauma or not? And if they do, where would they start in that journey?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that, I always encourage self-exploration. So whether that is with a therapist, a coach, an acupuncturist, like anybody that you've been seeing for greater health and well-being, I am a fan that can keep that self-exploration going. But I think that when people are feeling like they're really hitting a wall is when I see that there's probably something more of a trauma that's present, like overcoming, like being able to hold the emotional, let me think about it in different words. If people are able to hold their own work, right? They can do the self-exploration, they can journal, they can meditate, and they feel like they can hold that for themselves and they're able to move through and they're gaining insights. But once you just start feeling like you're stuck and you just keep hitting the same wall, or you just start feeling like, gosh, I just don't know how to get past this, it's a really good time to bring in a therapist. And if you have a suspicion that you're working with some trauma history, that there's either some singular incidents, or maybe that there's been a hard childhood and some developmental complex trauma, I highly recommended looking for trauma therapist. Not all therapists are trauma trained, and it takes specific training and knowing how to hold this type of process for someone so as not to re-traumatize them.
Yeah.
So I think looking for, there's actually directories like traumahealing.org. I think if that's still the domain, is the somatic experiencing. So you can literally go look for practitioners that are trained in something like somatic experiencing, which is trauma training. And even internal family systems, a lot of those therapists in that directory will say if they have specific trauma training, because not all IFS therapists do. But that's what I would suggest, really asking for help once you're kind of hitting that wall. I don't know if even in your own experience you can name, because I'm feeling like even my clients can probably name what that moment was better than I can. Like you sort of intuitively know. And I say when you get to that place where you're like, there's a nudge, there's a like tap on my shoulder.
Yeah.
It's a good time to seek help. Yeah. And ask for referrals from people that love their therapists. I think most of the people that I get come from word of mouth, not just a random Google search.
Yeah. What is a realistic expectation for people to have when starting this journey? Like what can they expect from working with a therapist?
Yeah. I think that, some therapists still work in very long format, and it, traditionally talk therapy can take weeks and months and years. I do think that a lot of these newer modalities, I'm going to say, like somatic experiencing, the body-based therapies are more of a short-term therapy that you can do some resolution within. It depends on your nervous system's ability to find a sense of connection and safety with that therapist, and then being able to, process even one trauma can give you access to that self-energy, and then help you hold the work, again, to use that term, in between sessions or for longer periods of time. So I think for people who are like, oh, I don't know if I have money for, just a few sessions, most therapists will suggest consecutive 12 weeks at least, to be able to develop rapport and trust and to get some foundation work done. Anything past then, is dependent on the diagnosis and the severity of the trauma. But I don't want people to be afraid that they have to commit forever. There are a lot of people who do therapy for short stints, and they get insight and transformation and different experiences in the body that allows them to move forward just from there without additional therapy, or years before they come in and then they want to work on something else.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
In what ways can people best facilitate that healing?
Mm-hmm. Like as far as on their own, even just
or just how can they maximize their progress in therapy?
Yeah. Well, I think like anything, it's in between the session work as well. People that I see get the most out of therapy are those that don't just show up for that 1 hour, but they actually then do the work in between. So often therapists, we give, what we call homework or in between session work. And that's expanding. Some different activities just expand upon the work done in the session. So it might be journaling, being able to continue to process with a theme, something that came up or a message from the body or in that session. Being able to do continual reading, like all these people that we've mentioned.
Yeah.
The more that my clients are just learning, not just waiting to learn it all from me, but learning from those teachers and trying to understand the modality. And then, there's self-guided IFS types of questions. I mean, actually, No Bad Parts is full of questions that Dr. Schwartz
exercises.
Exercises. They're not just like read it, which I love. So I encourage people to be able to do that work. Now, make a note if that feels too much, if it feels too overwhelming, and that's okay. Bring that to your therapist that you might not be able to hold that much in between sessions. And that's also okay, because that could be that your nervous system and your parts don't feel comfortable yet doing that work without a support system.
Yeah.
Something that I've recently introduced into my practice, which I think is really transformational, is moving my clients from just doing weekly, once a week, to doing more of what I call like an intensive therapy retreat.
Yeah.
And that's where we can spend like a day and a half to 3 days doing consecutive hours of work with mindfulness and nature immersion, talk therapy, somatic experiencing. Like I've put together somewhat of that as a newer integration of my own work, because I have found that some of this more body-based work, you open so much. And if you can leave that portal open, if you can leave that door open, then it allows for much more to be learned. And so I found I'm really looking forward to doing more of those types of sessions.
Yeah, it's a much more holistic approach.
Yeah.
What is is there the concept of a finish line in therapy? Like, what is a reasonable end goal outcome that people could set an expectation for when embarking on this journey?
kind of like we said earlier, it's more of a circle than it is up the mountain, or it's a spiral. I think that each person is going to differ. So I know people that see therapy as a part of their healing process and a part of their self-care. And they say they'll do it as long as they can. They see their therapist as a part of their support system, and they'll do it for years and they'll want to keep doing it. There are other people that can benefit from, like I said, maybe a 3 to 6 month amount of session, and then have like a graduation in which there's usually the therapist at that point will be like, okay, let's review what you've been able to do during this time together, what you can continue to do on your own, and then knowing that people know that they can come back into the work.
Right.
So I don't believe there's a finish line, and I think it's unique to each person. However, for a lot of people I just hear a lot of people afraid, like, oh, I don't want to start something that I just have to do for years. I believe that's a myth. I don't think that therapy necessarily has to be long-term to be extremely helpful and transformational, especially body-based therapies.
Yeah, it feels kind of like your physical health, where you can have a practice, but it does not necessarily have to involve a professional. Like, you can have a self-directed practice that is still beneficial to you.
Exactly. And I love hearing the ways in which my clients come back with their own ideas of what they've been able to incorporate. And then they have, okay, this is what I've learned about myself. And if I do this, on a regular basis, this really helps with my self-care, and I can't let that slide. Like, that's a non-negotiable. Or maybe there's other things that they're like, yeah, I can take it or leave it, but like this practice. And that's what I love to see is I want to enable and empower people to do what is within them. And I do believe that everyone has their inner healer. And I am there to mirror that back, to hold space when it feels too overwhelming, in order for them to begin to reclaim that part of themselves and to trust that part of themselves with a capital S exists.
Yeah, awesome. So we are almost at time here. I know you have some other commitments that you have to get to. If people want to find out more about you or your work, or want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Thanks for asking. I think the best place right now is my website, which is laurashookguzman.com. And that one has all of my information about how to work with me. I have some blog articles there. I also have a subscribe to my newsletter, and I'm actually about to launch a new newsletter that I'm hoping that will continue to provide everyone with a lot of tools that they can do the self-directed work. And I specifically have a page on there called Tools for Founders. And so for any of those listeners that are self-employed, that are doing that, the journey of entrepreneurship, then I have a special place on my site for them to visit for a whole bunch of different free resources beyond just me and my practice, but all the resources that I've cultivated from other sources.
Awesome. You are also working on a book at the moment. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yes.
I know it's still in development.
Thanks, David. This is why I tell people to help hold me accountable and help me promote. But yes, I am really excited. I've been doing a lot of writing for years, but the book is really starting to form itself around being able to speak to this through line of trauma, and those that are very high achieving founder entrepreneur types. And I've been identifying particular profiles of these high achievers, and how different trauma is tracked with the way that we show up in the world. And with kind of similar to Gabor Mate, that's why I was like, this is serendipitous that his book just came out. I'm going to be speaking a lot about how the current hustle culture is a collective trauma story.
Yeah.
And it continues to perpetuate this. So we can't just work on the founders and keep telling them that they need to work on their mental health. We have to look at the larger systemic issues at play in the organizations and business in like all the industries themselves, how they continue, like you mentioned, Elon Musk. Like, we've got to look at how sustainable and how healthy those types of systems are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if some parts are thriving while parts are suffering.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But I'm very hopeful that we are moving towards more integrated and compassionate frameworks. And some of my clients get on with me and, they're having a hard week and they're reading the news and they're just like, this is just too much. But I am privy, I guess, to some beautiful spaces in this world of entrepreneurship and this world of psychology, where people are bringing some really amazing frameworks into being.
Yeah.
Some system disruptors, some change makers, to use those those terms, but they're out there. People building new technology and just really passionate about doing mental health differently and being in a more kind, compassionate world. So I'm grateful to be a therapist at this time and to be able to learn from people like Peter Levine and Dr. Schwartz and Gabor Mate and Deb Dana, Stephen Porges, Dan Siegel. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really exciting time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, Laura, thank you for joining me today. I think this was an amazing conversation and one that I think people are going to learn a lot from. So I really appreciate you showing up today. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It was my pleasure.